Already in 2019, I've been blown away a few times at the sheer value for money on some of these phones. We've had devices from OnePlus, Honor, Asus, quite a few more, and yet none of them have impressed me as much as this guy, the Redmi K20 Pro. This is the China version right here, and inside the box it's pretty simple. You get an 18-watt fast charger and a USB Type-C cable. There is also an insert that came on top, and inside of that you've got a hard shell plastic case. It's quite a contrast to the body of the phone. Speaking of which, this is different. To give you a bit of context, this phone was nothing but a rumor until right after the announcement of the OnePlus 7. As soon as that happened, the VP of Xiaomi posted this tweet, implying that whilst OnePlus had just released a flagship, Xiaomi was about to drop a flagship killer 2.0. He then tells people to hold his dragon. We'll leave it at that. The implication is that in exactly the same way that OnePlus has referred to their phones as flagship killers by offering similar specs to much more expensive phones, Redmi has just pulled the same move on OnePlus. The K20 Pro, spec-wise, sits somewhere in between the OnePlus 7 and the OnePlus 7 Pro, but in terms of price, it even makes the base standard OnePlus 7 look expensive. The China model I have right here has a starting price that converts to $360. So even if this ends up being $399 when we see it on the mass market, there's a definite price gap. So where is the compromise? It's definitely not in the body of the phone. The K20 Pro is surrounded by 3D curved glass, and the design itself is apparently inspired by fire. The way it actually looks depends massively on the lighting conditions you see it in. In broad daylight, it glistens in its own trippy, multicolored way, but move out of the light and it becomes subtler and a little bit less polarizing than it looked in the official renders. I like it. There is a definite illusion of depth, and it doesn't look as cheap as I was worried it might. Not to mention, that pop-up camera has LED lights built into it. That is a massive power move, and also allows the ring on top to double as a notification LED. I would say it's not as useful as having one on the front of your phone, because it does restrict what angles you can actually see it from, but nonetheless better than not having one. Oh yeah, and the phone has a headphone jack. Now, in a lot of ways, this device is a very direct competitor to the OnePlus 7 Pro, and so it makes sense to review it in relation to that. Both have identical large 4000 mAh batteries with the capability to charge at a similar rate, although for some reason in the box itself it only comes with an 18-watt charger. They're also both equipped with really good optical in-display fingerprint scanners, although OnePlus's is on average a fraction faster. Even the camera arrangement looks almost copy and pasted. With both you have a pop-up front camera and this vertical triple camera setup on the rear, with one main camera, one ultra-wide, and one telephoto lens. But there is more than meets the eye. For starters, this phone really makes you appreciate what a great job OnePlus has done with the speed of the pop-up. There's a pretty reasonable time lag here when opening the one on the Redmi, although closing it is better. In terms of selfies, it's good. Compared to the back camera, shots look a little bit washed out, but it feels intentional, as it's more flattering on people's faces. They've added a mini panorama feature that lets you quickly tilt your phone around and capture a much wider selfie, almost simulating having an ultra-wide lens on the top. It is super simple, but super effective. As for the primary cameras on the back, while both are using the same 48 megapixel sensor, a combination of OnePlus's larger aperture and two very different image processing algorithms does mean that for the same photo, you can still get two very different results. If you move to an extreme scenario, the Redmi does fall behind in dynamic range, but for the price, they've knocked it out the park. The K20 Pro also has a 2x telephoto camera, and it's serviceable, it just won't look great if you want to digitally zoom further than that. Then there's the ultra-wide, which has a completely different story. It's got a mega field of view, making even objects that are pretty close to you look distant, which in this case is a good thing. I was relieved when it came to video. It's one of those areas where corners are often cut, but in this case you can still record 4K video at up to 60 frames per second, and it's pretty crispy. In fact, just to see if you'd notice, I actually recorded one of the earlier clips in this video on that phone. Not bad. Night mode is definitely on the noisy side, although because this is early software, it's very possible you could see an improvement. The hardware is definitely more capable than the end result is indicating. If you do want to see a detailed camera comparison with this phone, then do subscribe, I would really appreciate it. Now, both of these devices even have a lot of the same omissions. No wireless charging, no IP rating, and no microSD card support. The latter is a bit more of a blow to the K20 Pro, because in order to achieve that headline-grabbing price, their base model starts with only 64 gigs internally. If you're the kind of person who wants to download music and videos, or keep your photos stored locally, I wouldn't recommend that option. I'd already used 23 gigs by the time I just installed some of the games I wanted to test it with. The other thing I did notice was the phone's haptic engine is pretty meh. You'll notice a stark difference between this and, let's say, the latest iPhone, but for most people this is a subtle point. When it comes to display, the K20 Pro checks quite a few boxes. It is completely uninterrupted across the front of the phone, it's fairly bright, and it's punchy thanks to AMOLED tech. As a cherry on top, it also supports hardware DC dimming, which for some people, when your phone's display is on lower levels of brightness, it can help to reduce eye fatigue. However, it's not really comparable to the OnePlus 7 Pro in terms of resolution, refresh rate, or that phone's ability to support HDR10+ content, and falls much closer to the 7. But it's easy to forget that that in itself is an achievement. The Redmi K20 Pro is so good in so many ways that a lot of the time it doesn't even register how cheap it is. And for me, that is exactly what a flagship killer should be. It's using Gorilla Glass 5, so not the absolute latest and greatest, but up there with the likes of OnePlus. Worth noting is that audio is a little muffled compared to some of its dual speaker counterparts. In fact, a lot of those phones use the earpiece just to handle higher frequencies, and so because this phone doesn't do that, its overall pitch is a little lower, but the volume is equivalent because it does have a really large sound chamber. The phone is powerful. In many regions, this will be the cheapest Snapdragon 855 smartphone money can buy, and it combines that with an 8-layered cooling system. And the thermals on this phone are really good. This right here is the heat map after having been used heavily for 45 minutes. The K20 Pro pulls nearly 370,000 points on Antutu, so yeah, that should tell you most of what you need to know about performance, but in case it needed clarifying, yes, it's really snappy. The software, MIUI 10, is no match for this kind of hardware. Every animation feels fast and uninterrupted, and I really like the visual overhaul compared to MIUI 9. I've said this before, but the navigation gestures here are some of the easiest and the most intuitive, and it's great to see that the phone's Android Q beta build has already been released. Alright, so I'm not a huge fan of all the marketing gimmicks associated with the K20 Pro, but that doesn't change the fact that this phone really is a life hack. It is far cheaper than the competition, and there is very little to show for it. If you enjoyed this video, a sub would be massively appreciated. My name is Aaron, this is Mr. Who's the Boss, and I'll catch you in the next one.